200 samurai stood against 13,000 warriors, not defending a fortress, not behind walls, in an open field, with nowhere to retreat. Their commander, Isono Kazumasa, knew with absolute certainty that by sunset, every single one of his men would be dead, and he gave the order to charge anyway. By the time the killing stopped, those 200 samurai had accomplished something that defies every principle of military logic. They bought enough time for their master's entire army to cross a raging river, regroup, and win a battle that would reshape Japan's destiny. 7,000 enemy soldiers fell that day. But here's what makes this genuinely insane. Isono's sacrifice was never supposed to work. Here's what I'm going to reveal. First, the brutal mathematics of why 200 men couldn't possibly hold back 13,000 for more than 8 minutes by every historical calculation. Second, the psychological weapon Isono wielded that was more terrifying than any sword, a weapon that turned disciplined warriors into hesitant executioners. Third, the bitter truth about what happened to the army Isono saved, and why his perfect sacrifice led to the one outcome he fought to prevent. But before we get there, how could 200 men create enough chaos to stall an army 5 times their size? Why did samurai doctrine, which prized survival and glory, demand this particular form of mass suicide? What made the Asai clan so desperate that throwing away their elite guard seemed like the only option? How did Isono convince 200 warriors to follow him into certain death without a single deserter? This is the story of Isono Kazumasa and how 200 samurai became a human dam against an unstoppable flood. To understand how they accomplished the impossible on July 30th, 1570, we need to step back to the moment when Japan's most dangerous alliance shattered. To understand how 200 men could change the course of Japanese history in their final moments, let me take you to the summer of 1570, when the ancient temples of Mount Hiei looked down upon a Japan tearing itself apart. For 15 years, the country had been fragmenting into warring territories, each ruled by daimyo lords who sensed the old order dying. The Ashikaga shogunate, once the ultimate authority, had become a puppet institution. Real power belonged to whoever could seize it. Into this chaos stepped Oda Nobunaga, a 36-year-old warlord from Owari province, whose military innovations and absolute ruthlessness had already earned him control of central Japan. Unlike traditional daimyo who respected ancient alliances and religious sanctuaries, Nobunaga saw only obstacles to be eliminated. When Buddhist monks armed themselves against him, he burned their temples. When rival clans hesitated, he struck first. By 1570, he'd forced the Ashikaga shogun to crown him as the realm's de facto ruler. But two powerful northern clans, the Asai and the Asakura, watched Nobunaga's expansion with growing alarm. When Nobunaga attacked the Asakura domain without warning, breaking a personal oath to Asai Nagamasa, the betrayal was complete. The alliance that might have unified Japan peacefully instead exploded into war. Asai Nagamasa was 27 years old that summer, lord of a prosperous domain in Omi province. He had everything to lose. His castle at Odani was magnificent, his lands rich, his samurai renowned for discipline. More painful still, his wife, Oichi, was Nobunaga's own sister, given in marriage 3 years earlier to seal their alliance. Now Nagamasa faced an impossible choice: abandon his oldest ally, the Asakura, or go to war against his brother-in-law. He chose honor over family. Contemporary records describe him as a man of rigid principle, bound by Bushido to support the Asakura even when logic screamed otherwise. His advisors urged caution. His wife reportedly wept, caught between blood and loyalty. But Nagamasa gave the order the Asai would march against Nobunaga. They called him the Lord of Northern Omi, a man whose word was his life. That unbreakable principle was about to cost him everything. Oda Nobunaga was 36, and by 1570, he'd earned a reputation that made hardened warriors nervous. He'd risen from a minor clan by ignoring every rule of samurai warfare. At Okihazama in 1560, he'd defeated an army 10 times his size through pure audacity, a night raid in a thunderstorm that decapitated enemy command before most soldiers knew battle had started. He pioneered the mass use of arquebuses, the Portuguese firearms that transformed Japanese warfare from ritualized combat to mechanical slaughter. Where traditional daimyo sought glory through single combat and elaborate ceremony, Nobunaga sought results through any means necessary. He was tall for the era, with a face contemporaries described as severe, almost cruel. His temper was legendary. He once killed a tea master for preparing an inferior ceremony. But his genius for logistics, combined with absolute moral flexibility, made him the most dangerous man in Japan. When he learned of the Asai betrayal, he didn't rage. He calculated. The Asai-Asakura alliance fielded perhaps 30,000 warriors. His own force in their territory numbered barely 20,000. And now he was surrounded. The power dynamic was brutal. The combined Asai-Asakura armies controlled the northern approaches, with veteran samurai who'd been fighting for generations. Their lands were defensible, their supply lines secure. Nobunaga's forces were deep in hostile territory, their path home blocked by the Asai domains they'd marched through as allies. The gold in the Asai treasury could sustain years of warfare. Nobunaga's finances were already stretched from constant campaigns. It wasn't a question of if Nobunaga would have to retreat, but whether he'd escape at all. The strategic consensus among every observer was clear. Nobunaga had overreached, and the wolves were closing in. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you. The Asai hadn't wanted this war. Nagamasa sent 3 separate messages to Nobunaga in the weeks before, begging him to make peace with the Asakura, offering to mediate. Nobunaga ignored them all. So, when Asakura Yoshikage's urgent message arrived, "The Oda are attacking my southern border," Nagamasa made his choice in less than an hour. He mobilized his entire army, every able-bodied samurai and Ashigaru foot soldier, and marched south to trap Nobunaga between 2 armies. As Asakura forces descended from the north and Asai warriors moved to cut off the southern escape routes, the stage was set for what should have been Nobunaga's annihilation. Instead, it became the day 200 men would rewrite the definition of sacrifice. The combined Asai-Asakura force that converged on the Anegawa River region numbered approximately 18,000 warriors, though some records claim as many as 23,000 when you include support troops and armed monks from the Enryakuji temple. If they'd marched in a single column, the army would have stretched nearly 8 miles. The Asakura contingent brought 8,000 men, including their elite Asakura Kagetake's guard unit samurai, who'd trained from childhood in the mountainous north, experts at rapid deployment and disciplined formation fighting. Each wore lacquered armor in the Asakura clan colors, Dumaru chest plates that weighed 35 pounds, layered to stop both blade and early firearms. Their primary weapons were 11-foot yari spears with razor-sharp tips, designed for the tight formation fighting that had proven devastatingly effective in recent campaigns. Behind them came 2,000 arquebus-armed ashigaru, carrying the Portuguese-style Tanegashima firearms that had revolutionized warfare. Each gun could punch through armor at 80 yards. And while slow to reload nearly a full minute per shot, massed arquebus fire could shatter a cavalry charge before it closed distance. The Asai fielded 10,000 warriors, their strength concentrated in mounted samurai 800 heavy cavalry, who represented the flower of northern Omi's warrior class. These weren't raiders or scouts. They were shock troops, each rider wearing 60 to 70 pounds of armor, mounted on horses specially bred for size and aggression. Their naginata polearms and tachi longswords had been forged by master swordsmiths, blades worth more than a farmer's lifetime earnings. At the army's core stood the Isono unit, 800 samurai personally loyal to Isono Kazumasa, Nagamasa's most trusted general. They wore distinctive white horo cloaks that billowed behind them in combat, originally designed to catch arrows but serving primarily as recognition markers in the chaos of battle. The combined force required 200 tons of rice per week just for basic rations. Their supply train included 1,400 pack horses, mobile forges for weapon repair, and a portable headquarters complex that took 300 men to assemble. This wasn't just an army. It was a mobile siege machine designed to crush Nobunaga's forces through sheer, overwhelming power and then hold territory indefinitely. Against this juggernaut, Nobunaga had scrambled to assemble roughly 23,000 warriors, but the numbers lied. Half were ashigaru conscripts, farmers given spears and minimal training, rushed to the front to bulk up his ranks. His truly reliable force numbered perhaps 13,000 samurai and experienced foot soldiers. Worse, they'd been marching and fighting for weeks, their supplies running low, their spirits shaken by the sudden betrayal. Yet Nobunaga had two critical advantages. First, his allied commander Tokugawa Ieyasu, the man who would eventually become shogun and unify Japan, had brought 5,000 superbly trained troops from Mikawa province. These were veterans of constant border warfare, disciplined and lethal. Second, Nobunaga himself had become a master of aggressive tactics that turned numerical disadvantage into psychological advantage. His samurai knew that retreat meant death anyway, so they fought with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose. But the quality versus quantity argument had limits. You couldn't bluff your way past 18,000 warriors who controlled your escape route. The Anegawa River cut through the disputed territory like a natural moat, 80 yards wide at the main crossing points, running fast and deep from summer rains. Its banks were steep, the northern side higher, giving defensive advantage to whoever held that ground. The Asai-Asakura alliance controlled the northern bank, forcing Nobunaga's army to approach from the south across open ground with no cover. Whoever controlled the river crossings controlled central Japan's main north-south road. If Nobunaga couldn't break through here, his entire army would be trapped between the river and the pursuing Asakura forces from the north. The flat rice paddies on both sides meant no forests to hide in, no hills for defensive positions. This would be a daylight slaughter in the open, visible for miles. Nagamasa couldn't bypass it, because letting Nobunaga escape meant watching him grow stronger and return with vengeance. Every strategic calculation pointed to the same conclusion. The psychological warfare began before armies even arrived in force. Asakura raiding parties burned 30 villages in 3 days, sending smoke pillars rising that were visible from Nobunaga's camp 15 miles away. They killed supply wagons, poisoned wells, and left crucified messengers as warnings. The message was clear. You're cut off. You're surrounded, and we're going to take our time destroying you. Nobunaga's response defied every convention of samurai warfare. Instead of digging in defensively or attempting to negotiate, he ordered his entire army to advance toward the river at forced march pace. Contemporary accounts describe his retainers as stunned, charging toward superior numbers while exhausted and undersupplied violated basic military logic. But Nobunaga understood something his enemies didn't. The longer he waited, the more time they had to perfect their trap. Speed and aggression were his only weapons against numerical superiority. What appeared to be reckless desperation was actually calculated audacity. But Asai Nagamasa had made a critical miscalculation. He assumed Nobunaga would defend. He prepared for siege. He never imagined his enemy would attack. The timeline of the Anegawa campaign compressed into 6 days of mounting desperation that began on July 25th, 1570. Day 1. July 25th. Nobunaga received confirmed intelligence that the Asai army had mobilized and was moving to block his southern retreat route. His war council convened at dawn. Senior retainers argued for immediate withdrawal toward Kyoto before the trap closed. Nobunaga overruled them. Instead, he split his forces, a move that made veteran samurai audibly gasp. He sent 8,000 troops under his most reliable commanders to conduct a fighting retreat that was actually a feint, drawing Asakura attention northward. The remaining forces, including Tokugawa's contingent, would wheel south and smash through the Asai positions before they could fully entrench. It was brilliant or suicidal, depending on whether you believed Nobunaga could move 15,000 men faster than the Asai could fortify the river crossings. The dice were thrown. Day 2, July 26th. The armies began their collision course. Asai scouts reported Nobunaga's unexpected advance, and Nagamasa faced his own crisis of decision. Should he wait in strong defensive positions or meet the Oda in open battle? His advisors split. Isono Kazumasa advocated for the aggressive option. If we let Nobunaga choose the ground, we've already lost. The Asai army moved to establish positions on the northern bank of the Anegawa, but not as entrenched as they could have been. This half measure would prove costly. Meanwhile, Nobunaga's forces marched 18 miles in brutal heat, men collapsing from exhaustion. They'd been rationed to half portions for 3 days. Cavalry horses were showing signs of strain, but by nightfall on the 26th, the Oda vanguard had visual contact with Asai positions. The pieces were moving into place. Day 3, July 27th. The harassment began in earnest. Asai cavalry units, fast, light raiders, struck Nobunaga's column at dawn, loosing arrows from 60 yards before wheeling away. They weren't seeking decisive combat, just bleeding the enemy through 1,000 cuts. In the first 3 hours, Nobunaga lost 40 men to these tactics. By noon, 90. By sunset, 140. The Ashigaru foot soldiers, already exhausted, began to crack psychologically. Every shadow might conceal an archer. Every tree line could hide cavalry. The urge to break formation and chase the raiders burned in every warrior's heart, but Nobunaga's discipline held. Officers rode up and down the lines with orders, "Hold formation, keep moving. Anyone who breaks ranks dies by my blade before the enemy touches them." His ruthlessness kept order, but the cost in morale was mounting. Day 4, July 28th. The water crisis hit. The summer heat was merciless chronicles. described temperatures that modern analysis suggests reached 105 degrees Fahrenheit by midday. Men marched in 60 to 70 pounds of armor. Tongues swelled, vision blurred from dehydration. The Asai had poisoned or blocked the obvious water sources. Nobunaga's force was reduced to rationing from whatever streams they could secure, and those were contested. 3 separate skirmishes erupted over access to a single well. The Oda lost 80 men just trying to get water. Soldiers began drinking from rice paddies, risking dysentery. Nobunaga himself was seen dismounting and drinking from the same muddy water as his ashigaru, a gesture that bought loyalty when logic suggested desertion. But even loyalty has limits when men are dying of thirst. Day 5, July 29th. Near breaking point. One of Nobunaga's allied commanders, Sakuma Nobumori, sent a secret message suggesting they negotiate surrender terms while they still had enough strength to demand honor rather than annihilation. The message was intercepted by Nobunaga loyalists and brought to him. His response entered legend. He ordered Sakuma stripped of command, but kept with the army, so you can watch what happens when samurai trust their swords instead of their fears. The demotion sent shockwaves through the ranks. If even high-ranking commanders were losing faith, what hope did common soldiers have? That night, approximately 120 ashigaru deserted, slipping away into the darkness. Nobunaga let them go. He needed men who'd fight, not prisoners who'd run at first contact. Meanwhile, the Asai Asakura noose was tightening. Scouts reported the combined armies were now in position on the Anegawa's northern bank. Their formations complete, their trap ready to spring. What happened next defied everything contemporary observers understood about battlefield tactics. Nobunaga's war council reconvened at dawn on July 30th, and he unveiled a plan so aggressive it bordered on madness. Instead of a cautious river crossing or a defensive stand, he ordered a full-scale assault across the Anegawa, at first light against entrenched enemies on higher ground, across a fast-moving river, with exhausted troops and no reserve forces. Tokugawa Ieyasu, normally unflappable, reportedly said, "This is how we win or how we're remembered as the greatest fools in Japanese history. There's no middle ground." But Nobunaga had identified a critical weakness in the Asai Asakura deployment. They'd positioned their forces too close together, banking on concentrated power rather than mobility. If Nobunaga could punch through fast enough, he could split their army before they could reinforce. It was a strategy that only worked if every unit performed perfectly, if the initial assault created such shock that the enemy froze, if luck itself bent toward the attackers. The tactical innovation was actually psychological. Nobunaga positioned his arquebusiers in a revolutionary formation, 3 rotating ranks that maintained nearly continuous fire instead of the traditional single volley, followed by long reload. Each rank would fire, fall back to reload, while the next rank stepped forward. The sustained roar of gunfire would create the illusion of overwhelming firepower, even though total numbers were inferior. He drilled his commanders for weeks on coordinated timing. The instant the arquebus fire begins, the cavalry charges. Not 5 seconds later, simultaneously. We hit them with sound, smoke, and steel all in the same heartbeat. Modern historians studying Anegawa recognize this as an early implementation of combined arms assault doctrine, using different unit types in synchronized attack to create psychological and tactical overload. The principle wouldn't be formally codified in European military academies for another 150 years. Yet Nobunaga intuited its power through pure tactical genius. The enemy's critical miscalculation was assuming Nobunaga would behave rationally. Nagamasa had positioned his forces, expecting a probing attack, maybe an attempted flanking maneuver, certainly a cautious approach given Oda's numerical disadvantage. He never prepared for what was actually coming. A headlong charge by the entire Oda Tokugawa army in a single massed assault designed to overwhelm defenders through sheer audacity and violence of action. The Asai commanders had positioned their reserve units 3 miles behind the front lines, believing they'd have hours of warning before committing them. That assumption was about to cost thousands of lives. As dawn broke on July 30th, 1570, Nobunaga gave the signal. The trap he'd spent 5 days preparing, a trap made of speed, aggression, and the willingness to stake everything on a single roll, was about to snap shut. But Asai Nagamasa didn't know it yet. He was still positioning his tea ceremony pavilion on a hill overlooking the river, expecting to watch a conventional battle unfold. What he was about to witness would redefine Japanese warfare. At 6:47 a.m. on July 30th, precisely as the sun cleared the eastern mountains, 3 war drums thunder in perfect unison from Nobunaga's command position. The signal ripples down the line. 13,000 Oda Tokugawa warriors surge forward toward the Anegawa River. On the opposite bank, Asai sentries freeze for a precious 3 seconds, their minds refusing to process what their eyes are seeing. An entire army is charging in full daylight across open ground toward entrenched positions. It violates every tactical principle they've ever learned. The first arquebus volley crashes across the river like thunder. 800 firearms erupt simultaneously, sending lead balls screaming toward the northern bank. The psychological impact of massed gunfire is devastating even before the smoke clears. Before casualties are assessed, the sheer noise and fury of it creates primal fear. Then the second rank steps forward and fires. 5 seconds later, the third rank. The roar becomes continuous. Asai warriors who fought for years have never experienced sustained arquebus fire. They think, impossibly, that they face thousands of guns instead of 800 rotating in disciplined sequence. The ground literally shakes under 3,000 cavalry hooves. Nobunaga's mounted samurai hit the river at full charge, the leading edge smashing into the water in an explosion of spray and fury. Horses scream. The crash of thousands of warriors entering water at speed sounds like a thunderstorm. Behind them, 8,000 Ashigaru foot soldiers follow, roaring war cries in 3 dialects. The Asai defenders finally react, their own arquebusiers raising weapons, their spearmen moving to the bank. But they're a half-second slow. They're reacting instead of acting. In battle, that half-second is the difference between winning and dying. The impact on the northern bank jars every arm. Nobunaga's cavalry crashes into the Asai front line like a tsunami hitting a seawall. The 8-foot Yari spears carried by Oda samurai outreach Asai weapons by just 2 feet. Doesn't sound like much until you're the one being stabbed first, unable to retaliate before steel punches through your throat. Bronze armor catches the morning sun, creating a wall of glittering death. The air fills with sounds no human voice can describe. Metal on bone on flesh, screams in register too high or low for normal speech, the wet sounds of bodies failing. A mounted samurai at full charge generates kinetic energy equivalent to a modern car crash at 30 miles per hour. When that impact hits a man wearing 40 pounds of armor, physics is brutally simple. Bones shatter. Internal organs rupture. Bodies fly backward into the warriors behind them, creating domino cascades of trauma. The Asai front line doesn't just buckle. It disintegrates. In the first 30 seconds, 200 Asai warriors simply cease to exist as functional combat units dead, dying, or too wounded to fight, the impossible begins. The disciplined Asai formation, designed to hold against numerical superiority, starts to waver. Officers scream orders that can't be heard over the chaos. Warriors trained since childhood to hold formation find themselves stumbling backward over corpses, losing cohesion. The plan was to let Nobunaga exhaust himself attacking, then counterattack with fresh reserves. But nobody told them about the sustained arquebus fire, the coordinated assault, the shocking psychological weight of watching an entire army charge with suicidal confidence. This isn't battle anymore. It's a cascading systems failure. While all attention focuses on the main assault at the central crossing, Tokugawa Ieyasu 5,000 troops have been quietly moving downstream to a secondary ford. The Asai assigned 800 warriors to guard that approach, thinking it a minor threat. At 7:03 a.m., Tokugawa's entire force hits that position from an unexpected angle, having forded the river 400 yards further south than scouts anticipated. The defenders fight bravely for exactly 6 minutes before being overwhelmed by numbers and expertise. At 7:15 a.m., panic begins its deadly work. An Asai cavalry unit positioned as reserve sees the chaos, sees their front line collapsing, and makes the fatal mistake of charging in piecemeal instead of waiting for coordinated reinforcement. They gallop straight into Nobunaga's prepared arquebus positions. The rotating fire doctrine shreds them. 40 riders fall in the first volley. The rest wheel in confusion, their charge broken before it could impact enemy lines. The sight of elite cavalry retreating sends psychological shockwaves through the entire Asai line. If the mounted samurai can't break through, what chance do foot soldiers have? The impossible is happening. 13,000 Oda Tokugawa warriors are in the process of breaking through 10,000 Asai defenders who hold superior ground, who started the day with every tactical advantage. In just under 30 minutes of sustained assault, the casualty ratio defies belief. Approximately 800 Asai casualties versus 290 Oda Tokugawa. What every military manual said was impossible is unfolding before 50,000 eyes. The Asai Elite Guard, the famed Isono unit that has never known defeat, begins to waver at its edges. And that's when Asai Nagamasa makes the decision that will define the battle and doom 200 men to certain death. Nagamasa recognizes the disaster unfolding but refuses to accept defeat. At 7:43 a.m., he gives the order that every commander dreads: full retreat to regroup. But retreats in the 16th century aren't organized withdrawals, they're invitations to massacre. The moment Asai warriors turn their backs, Nobunaga's troops surge forward in pursuit. The killing extends for miles. Oda samurai chase down fleeing Asai foot soldiers with methodical brutality. The rice paddies become death traps, the soft mud slowing runners to exhausted stumbles while mounted pursuers cut them down from behind. The ravines north of the river become clogged with bodies, the dead literally cushioning the dying as layers of corpses pile 3 deep. Blood turns the Anegawa's tributary streams rust red for hours. In 24 minutes of pursuit and slaughter, 1,400 Asai warriors fall. Present tense horror becomes past tense statistics. By 8:10 a.m., the core Asai army has shattered into fragments, each group fleeing independently toward Odani Castle or the mountain passes, anywhere that offers illusion of safety. but Nagamasa's personal retreat is what forces Isono Kazumasa to make his impossible choice. The Asai Lord himself, surrounded by 300 personal guard, gallops toward the northern hills. Behind them, approximately 4,000 surviving Asai troops attempt to follow a disorganized mob of exhausted, terrified warriors. And behind them, Nobunaga's entire army pursues like wolves who've tasted blood. If Nobunaga's forces catch Nagamasa in the open, the war ends today with the Asai Lord's head on a pike. Isono Kazumasa sees this with perfect clarity. He's 44 years old, a veteran of 30 years of warfare, Nagamasa's most trusted general and childhood friend. His 800-man unit is the last organized force in the Asai army. Mathematically, even his elite troops can't stop 13,000 pursuers, but they can slow them. At 8:23 a.m., Isono orders his unit to halt. Turn. Form ranks. Behind him, the fleeing Asai army continues north. Ahead, Nobunaga's vanguard, approximately 3,000 cavalry and forward infantry, approaches at speed. Isono's subordinate commanders immediately understand. Contemporary records claim only 3 men requested permission to leave and escort their families to safety. Isono denied all 3. If we do not hold here, your families die anyway when Nobunaga burns Odani, at least die as samurai. The unit formed their final ranks in complete silence. What followed wasn't battle in any conventional sense. It was 800 men weaponizing their own deaths. At 8:30 a.m., Isono's unit charges directly into Nobunaga's vanguard. They have no illusions about victory. Their goal is singular: create such chaos, such furious resistance, that the Oda pursuit grinds to a halt long enough for Nagamasa to escape. For this to work, they can't just fight. They have to fight with such savage ferocity that the enemy pauses to regroup instead of flowing around them. The collision is apocalyptic. Isono's samurai fight like men possessed, because in a sense they are possessed by the certainty that every second they buy costs them everything. A Tokugawa retainer's diary later recorded, "The Isono unit fought as though each warrior was the last man alive. They took wounds that should have killed them and continued fighting. We cut them down and they rose. We've never seen such devotion to death." Isono himself, wielding a Nodachi great sword, personally kills 9 Oda samurai in the first 5 minutes. His distinctive white horo cloak becomes soaked red but remains visible, a rallying point for his dying men. At 8:42 a.m., an arquebus ball shatters his left knee. He continues fighting from the ground. At 8:47 a.m., a Yari spear punches through his chest armor. He pulls the spear toward himself, dragging the attacker close enough to decapitate with his broken blade. The mathematics of annihilation played out over 17 brutal minutes. By 8:47 a.m., 600 of Isono's 800 men were dead or incapacitated. By 8:50 a.m., the number reached 750. The final 50 formed a circle around their dying commander and fought until none could raise a weapon. Isono Kazumasa died at approximately 8:52 a.m., his body bearing 14 separate fatal wounds. Oda soldiers who recovered his corpse reportedly bowed before presenting the head to Nobunaga, an unprecedented gesture of respect for an enemy. Nobunaga himself later wrote, "The Isono unit showed us what it means to be samurai. Their deaths bought their master life. There is no greater service." The cruel arithmetic worked. Nobunaga's vanguard, instead of pushing through, halted to reform ranks and treat casualties. The pause lasted 28 minutes. Nagamasa's fleeing force gained 5 miles of distance, enough to reach defensible positions near Odani. The Asai Lord lived to fight another day. The final statistics defied all military logic. Asai dead, approximately 1,800. Oda, Tokugawa, casualties, 870. The Isono unit, which fought outnumbered 1/6 in its final stand, personally inflicted 320 casualties before being annihilated. Let that ratio sink in. They achieved roughly 1-2. 5 casualty ratios in their final minutes, meaning every samurai who fell took multiple enemies with them. As sunset painted the Anegawa red, burial details counted bodies. The river valley had become a slaughterhouse. Nobunaga ordered Isono's remains treated with honor, cremated separately, ashes returned to Asai territory under flag of truce. Even in victory, he recognized that the 200 samurai who'd made the final stand, the remnant of Isono's 800 who fought the delaying action's last phase, had accomplished something that defied every military principle he knew. They'd turned certain defeat into negotiated survival. Through death, they'd bought time. Through sacrifice, they'd salvaged hope. The silence that followed the battle was more terrifying than the killing. 2,670 men had died in approximately 4 hours. The rice paddies were trampled into mud and blood. Crows gathered in numbers that blackened the sky. Within 3 months, the Battle of Anegawa's strategic consequences rippled across Japan. Nobunaga's victory cemented his reputation as unstoppable, attracting allied daimyo who sensed which way history was flowing. The Asai-Asakura alliance, though not destroyed at Anegawa, never recovered its offensive momentum. Psychologically, they'd learned that even with superior numbers and position, they couldn't stop Nobunaga's combination of tactical innovation and aggressive speed. Other regional powers took notice. Within a year, Nobunaga had absorbed 3 minor domains whose lords decided submission was wiser than resistance. The balance of power in central Japan tilted decisively. Economically, capturing the Anegawa crossing secured Nobunaga's supply lines to Kyoto, the imperial capital. The weapons and armor stripped from Asai, dead enough equipment for 1,500 warriors, provided immediate material gains. More importantly, the victory prevented the formation of a broader anti-Nobunaga coalition. Lords who might have joined the Asai cause instead chose neutrality or alliance with the winner. Asai Nagamasa lived for 3 more years after Anegawa. But they were years of slowly tightening siege and diminishing hope. He retreated to Odani Castle and held out through a combination of defensive brilliance and Nobunaga's strategic patience. In 1573, after a brutal siege, the castle finally fell. Nagamasa, true to his code of honor to the bitter end, committed seppuku ritual suicide rather than face capture. He was 30 years old. His wife, Oichi Nobunaga's sister, was spared and eventually remarried, though the political marriage that was supposed to prevent this war instead merely delayed it. When Nagamasa finally died, even Nobunaga reportedly observed 3 days of formal mourning, an extraordinary gesture toward a defeated enemy. His legacy in both friendly and enemy accounts was consistent. A man whose rigid honor became his fatal flaw. A contemporary chronicle recorded, Nagamasa could have bent and lived. Instead, he chose principle and perished. History judges whether this makes him a fool or a hero, but none dispute he was a true samurai. His name became synonymous with doomed loyalty, invoked in Japanese literature for centuries as the archetype of the honorable loser. But winning Anegawa actually sealed the seeds of Nobunaga's eventual downfall. By proving that aggressive assault and firearms coordination could overcome traditional samurai valor, he taught every other daimyo in Japan that the old rules were dead. Within a decade, his enemies had adopted his innovations, rotating arquebus fire, combined arms tactics, psychological warfare. The technological and tactical advantages that made him dominant in 1570 became standard doctrine by 1580. Even more critically, his ruthless treatment of defeated enemies and willingness to slaughter Buddhist monks who opposed him created a deep well of resentment. In 1582, just 12 years after Anegawa, one of Nobunaga's own generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, betrayed him, surrounding him at Honnoji Temple and forcing his suicide. The man who'd unified most of Japan through brilliant aggression died because that same aggression made too many enemies and trusted too few friends. The principles of relentless assault and tactical innovation that saved him at Anegawa ultimately couldn't protect him from betrayal. The seeds of ultimate defeat were planted in the moment of greatest triumph. Every enemy he made, every convention he shattered, contributed to the coalition of resentment that eventually killed him. Modern military historians recognize Anegawa as a watershed moment in the transformation of Japanese warfare from ritualized single combat toward modern combined arms doctrine. Academies from West Point to Japan's own National Defense Academy study the battle as the definitive example of how tactical audacity and psychological warfare can overcome numerical superiority. The rotating arquebus fire technique, though Nobunaga didn't invent it, was perfected at Anegawa and influenced military thinking for centuries. Napoleon's own doctrine of concentrated force and rapid assault echoes principles visible in Nobunaga's Anegawa strategy. Even in modern military analysis, the concept of tempo, maintaining attack speed faster than the enemy can respond, is demonstrated at Anegawa with textbook clarity. The sacrifice of Isono's unit specifically is studied as an example of how a determined delaying action can achieve strategic objectives despite tactical annihilation. Think about what Isono Kazumasa's choice means for understanding leadership and sacrifice. He possessed perfect information. He knew with absolute certainty that every man under his command would die. No chance of survival, no hope of rescue, no possibility of victory. Yet he convinced 200 warriors to make the same choice without a single deserter. That level of leadership, inspiring men to embrace certain death for a cause, represents something beyond tactical skill. It speaks to bonds of loyalty, clarity of purpose, and shared identity that modern military forces spend billions trying to replicate. When conditions demand it, when cause is clear enough and leadership trusted enough, humans are capable of sacrificing everything for their brothers. That principle hasn't changed in 455 years. In those 17 minutes along the Anegawa River, 200 samurai reminded Japan why the warrior code wasn't just about victory. It was about how you faced the inevitable. Isono's unit lost every battle-metric territory, survival, tactical position, and yet achieved their strategic goal completely. They transformed personal annihilation into collective salvation. The age of ritualized samurai warfare ended that day in blood and gunpowder smoke. In its place rose something more brutal and efficient, where tactics mattered more than honor, where innovation trumped tradition. But for 17 minutes, in their final moments, Isono Kazumasa's 200 demonstrated that even in history's most pragmatic age, there remained space for the kind of sacrifice that transcends calculation. They bought time with their lives and in doing so, bought their master 3 more years of resistance. 3 years that wouldn't have existed if 200 men hadn't looked at impossible odds and charged anyway.